Good afternoon, everyone, and happy Friday. Welcome to the first Lunch and Learn for the fall 2025 semester. I am very excited today to introduce Bryan Davis Jr. We had an opportunity to meet a few weeks back on something completely unrelated, and the more we got chatting, the more I realized what a great speaker you would be to kick off our fall season. So I'm just really happy to have you here. And a little background about Attorney Davis, an experienced labor attorney with a background focused on representation of public and private sector labor organizations in negotiating collective bargaining agreements, ensuring compliance with statutory and regulatory frameworks, and representing clients in labor arbitrations and matters arising before the Michigan Employment Relations Commission and the National Labor Relations Board. In his capacity as an Assistant Attorney General in the Michigan Department of Attorney General's Labor Division, his work primarily focuses on representation of state agencies and employees, advocating on behalf of clients in administrative hearings and appellate matters, and providing legal advice on novel and developing areas of the law. He also serves as an adjunct instructor for the Oakland Community College, our college, Police Academy, and Eastern Michigan University's Police and Fire Staff and Command. In these roles, he instructs on the fundamentals of labor relations, the historical background of both public and private sector labor, subjects of bargaining and employee rights under Garrity, Weingarten, and Lutermill. He also serves as an adjunct professor for Oakland University's paralegal program, teaching an introductory law and ethics course. In this role, he develops course materials and instructs on various topics, including but not limited to legal ethics, civil litigation, legal research and writing, and employment law. So, Attorney Davis, thank you so much for giving us your time today. What just a fantastic background, and we are looking forward to hearing from you.
Thank you so much. And I am very honored to be here today. I'm sure it's just for convenience of scheduling, but I'm going to tell myself that I am first up on your schedule because of how excited you all are to have me here today. But all joking aside, no, really very happy to be here today and quite a pleasure to be discussing specifically with OCC's paralegal program because I've heard nothing but great things about its program, its outcomes, and a lot of the great foundational knowledge that it provides to its students. So excited to be here, and thank you for probably too much flattery in that biography. But yes, that is a pretty full synopsis of my background and my experience. My employment actually with Oakland University's paralegal program did recently come to an end. But I was very honored to teach there for several semesters. And just as of today, workload obligations in other areas became a little bit greater. So great programs, I think, all around in this state. And I know OCC is certainly, that's certainly true for this program as well. Today, I wanted to focus primarily, obviously, on my work with the Department of Attorney General. Now, I have to put out this caveat that I'm obviously not here to give any legal advice or speak on behalf of the AG's office. I'm here in my own capacity. But I do want to have an opportunity to talk about kind of the structure of the AG's office as it relates to other state agencies and some of the work, just generally speaking, that the AG's office is a part of, and maybe how some of those different areas of work that we're involved in might prompt individuals in this program to want to explore some of those fields or subjects of law a little bit further. So with that, I'm obviously happy to talk about any of my experiences outside of the AG's office. I've been very fortunate, I think, to have a good wide array of experiences. As Sarah indicated, I was fortunate enough to have one of my first positions serve as in-house counsel for various labor organizations, both public and private sector. And actually, prior to that, I worked for the state with the Michigan Employment Relations Commission for a brief period of time. And now I've kind of come full circle back to state government. And that's where I find myself in a position, again, I consider myself very fortunate to hold. So with that, I thought maybe we would start off, if everyone's comfortable with it, I'd love to know a little bit more about some of the experience in this group, some of the background, some of the fields of law that individuals here are interested in. And then maybe I can highlight some of those as I go through my presentation. So, Sarah, I don't know if that's possible or if anyone's comfortable sharing. I didn't want to put
Yeah.
anyone on the spot, but I'd love
Yeah,
to know a
no,
little bit more.
absolutely. We can either do it through the chat, or you can just, unmute yourself and go ahead and ask. But these are very informal and very conversational. So absolutely, if any of our attendees have a kickoff question, now's a good time.
Yeah, that's perfect. Again, I'm pretty flexible on this. I want to touch on a couple different points, but throughout, I hope everyone's comfortable interjecting, raising questions, because I certainly personally never mind going down a rabbit hole every once in a while if it brings about some interesting conversation.
Excellent. I will track the chat and reach out, or if you see a little hand up, we can go from there.
Perfect. Perfect. Thank you. Well, so one thing that I think is helpful, at least as far as my work with the AG's office goes, and I've been with the AG's office um, a little over 2 years now. I think probably coming up closer to about 2.5+ years. And my capacity with the AG's office has been that of an assistant attorney general, and so I work within the AG's labor division. And I'll get into kind of the structure of the AG's office because it can be somewhat confusing to myself included sometimes. So, but I think what is especially helpful is just kind of that umbrella term, attorney general, especially as it pertains to state government. And so, in this capacity, a lot of times we refer to the attorney general of varying states, including Michigan, as the chief legal officer of those states. And so we see AGs in states around the nation, in commonwealths, in DC, and different territories of the US. And typically, the role really comprises the AG serving as what we would also refer to as a counselor to state governments and their agencies, also to legislatures, and really representatives of what we would call this overarching public interest of the people of the various states that the AGs represent or have been elected to represent. And so some of the very general powers, and these can vary depending on what state, what territory you find yourself in, but a lot of times some of the tried and true responsibilities for attorney generals will be issuing opinions to different state agencies depending on the issues that they might be coming up against. They might serve as advocates for areas including regulation of public utilities. It could be different issues pertaining to consumer protection. It could be that the Attorney General at times may opine or offer legal advice or counsel related to pending legislation going through the legislature, enforcement of federal, state laws within a given state. It could be that they handle different appellate matters. It could be that they themselves are instituting civil suits on behalf of a state. And certainly those are just some of the limited number of items that attorney generals engage in. But again, here within the state of Michigan as well, we refer to the AG as that top law enforcement official. And so here, the AG's capacity is to serve the people of Michigan, it's to serve the interests of the state, and that is through carrying out all of those statutory duties that the attorney general is obligated to perform. And so again, safeguarding from criminals in certain cases, helping certain victims of crimes. It could be combating issues such as human trafficking. I mean, so really the number of items that the Attorney General can and will oftentimes be involved in are incredibly wide ranging. And while I only occupy or really act in a capacity within our labor division, I can speak to that myself in that every day, and this is a gift and a curse, there is always something new that I am being confronted with. There is always something new to learn. There is always something new to investigate. And again, that makes for a very rewarding career, a very fulfilling career, but there is the occasional frustration because you never know the answer that you thought you did, or you're always finding out there's sometimes some new twists to the questions that you once thought you had the answers to. As for our Attorney General's office, we have, at least as I was last aware, we have over 500 total attorneys, investigators, a lot of criminal investigators, and then other employees clerical, administrative, who work within the Department of Attorney General, and they operate obviously throughout the state of Michigan. We have primary offices in Detroit, in Lansing. I primarily work out of our Detroit location, and so I know within our own location, we have various divisions, various attorneys working in there, and then obviously a lot of support staff who are really essential to the work that we do. And so again, a lot of the tried and trues that I emphasized previously about general obligations are obligations that our own Michigan AG carries out. Again, it could be that one day we're reviewing a contract for a client agency. It could be that we're collaborating with local prosecuting attorneys. It could be that we're serving as counsel to different state agencies and officers. It could be that we're handling appellate matters. But again, those are wide-ranging functions. And a lot of times we'll see that a lot of those obligations are founded in different statutory schemes, different legislation, I should say, that will grant the Attorney General certain powers over different subject matters and different issues. So it really is a very wide-ranging position. A couple different just background notes to the extent that anyone's interested is that a lot of times when we see that different public legal matters arise, issues that might be of widespread concern around the state of Michigan, we might oftentimes see that the Attorney General and the Attorney General's department will render different opinions on different issues of law. And again, that could be to the legislature, it could be to state officials that request those opinions. And it could also be that we find the Attorney General intervening in different issues. So maybe cases that the Attorney General hasn't brought in their own capacity, but issues in which the Attorney General might determine, yes, we have a compelling interest to act in some capacity, to intervene in this case because we need to represent a public interest that is at issue here. And so here, outside of that, we also see that in many situations, different state boards, different state commissions will also establish that the Attorney General is a member of those certain boards and commissions by virtue of their position. So again, it was the case at one point, and I believe it's still true, but don't hold me to this, that the Attorney General occupied a position or at least had a membership role in the Michigan Commission on Law Enforcement Standards, what we call MCOLS, our state administrative board. And again, this is fairly wide ranging, but it does go to speak to the wide array of items, of issues that the Attorney General is often involved in. And again, so while we recognize that the Attorney General represents state agencies, represents officials as well, we always have to stay cognizant of the fact that there is no law within the state of Michigan that authorizes the Attorney General to represent private employees. Okay, so that's always one clear distinction that I think sometimes is not always fully understood, is that yes, we refer to the AG as the chief law enforcement official, and yes, the Attorney General represents state agencies, state officials, but the Attorney General doesn't necessarily in a direct way represent private citizens. Obviously, as I alluded to, the Attorney General represents compelling public interest needs, compelling issues that might affect the public, but it's not representation to specific individuals. Okay? And again, like I said, over 500 individuals within our department, and a good number of those are comprised of assistant attorney generals, one of which I am, and fortunate to be. And so with our assistant attorney generals, obviously each of those individuals are required to have membership and be licensed within the state of Michigan. And we're appointed under Michigan Civil Service rules. And the Michigan Civil Service is an entity that I won't get into for our purposes today, but they play a pretty substantial role as far as the terms and conditions of employment for many state employees are concerned. And then, like I indicated, we have several investigators, several support staff, and I think that number is well over 100 of a combination of those individuals. And I'll dive into this just to an extent because I think it's interesting and it's also informative. I wouldn't expect everyone to remember this because I don't always remember all of it and I have to go back to a cheat sheet. But our department is organized into really what we would call three primary bureaus. So we have what we call a criminal justice bureau. We have a consumer and regulatory enforcement bureau. And then we also, excuse me, So we have our criminal, our consumer and regulatory, and then we have our what we refer to as an environment and government operations bureau. And so obviously at the highest level of our department is the attorney general. And then beneath the attorney general, we currently have two deputy attorney generals. And then beneath each of those, we have the individual bureaus. And those are the ones I just alluded to. But keep in mind, and this is where it gets really complex, is that within each of those bureaus, we have various divisions that handle subsets of legal components within each of those bureaus. So, for example, my position is within the labor division, and the labor division is housed within the Consumer and Regulatory Enforcement Bureau. Okay, and obviously, ultimately, each of these report to the deputy attorney generals and ultimately the attorney general. But this is a way in which different legal issues can be handled by the corresponding, what I'll say for lack of a better term, specialists in these areas. And so with that, I thought, I want to take a break for questions, but I thought what might be helpful now is if I kind of next, as a component to this discussion, is really detail what is the work that you might typically see an assistant attorney general engaged in, and maybe to some extent, how does that intersect with potential work of paralegals and other legal assistants? But before I do that, I see we have a question, so I'm happy to see that. It gives me a quick break here.
That's it. You just said what I was going to ask pretty much. I was just going to ask where the paralegals fit into the framework of day-to-day operations.
Yeah, and it's a great question. So here's what I'll say is in my capacity as an assistant attorney general, Sarah already detailed a lot of the work that I'm engaged in. But a substantial component of that is really dedicated to representation of individual state agencies. And a lot of times that representation, not always, but a lot of times that representation might come to us by virtue of the fact that maybe a state agency who's, bestowed with powers to regulate a certain industry. Maybe they have taken some action against an individual or an entity. Maybe they've issued a citation or a violation or noted some item or some action that is not in compliance with a particular code or requirement. Once those are issued, if it becomes the case that an individual or an entity is maybe not complying with the actions that that agency took, or if it's the case that an individual or entity is perhaps disputing a citation or a violation, that can oftentimes become the scenario where our offices might be engaged. Certainly, it could be prior to that, it could even be post that, but that a lot of times can become the situation where our offices become involved. And that is really at the level within the administrative schema where we might be preparing to go to an administrative hearing. And so with those administrative hearings, for example, if we know that an individual or an entity is disputing a citation or a violation, they're going to go through a procedure largely set forth through administrative code, through the Michigan's Administrative Procedures Act, but it dictates kind of those due process requirements. And so our offices will oftentimes take that up and go through the administrative hearing process before an administrative law judge, and eventually those will oftentimes work their way back to the board who will make that final determination. Certainly, after that incident arises, though, there are oftentimes instances where appeals will be taken to perhaps circuit court, to perhaps the Court of Appeals, and those again can be instances where the Attorney General's office will either begin offering or may continue to offer representation to the state agency when those appellate matters arise. So that's a huge component of our work. But the reason I kind of went into detail on that is because this is really the component, at least within our offices, where we have a good amount of interaction with not who we refer to and not who we work with as paralegals, but a lot of our legal assistants and a lot of the secretarial staff who work, support staff who work within our offices. And so a lot of times our interactions are including assistance in preparing witness and exhibit lists. A lot of times this might involve documentation related to notices of appearance in certain courts. It'll include a substantial amount of filing, not just with what we refer to as the Michigan Office of Administrative Hearings and Rules, but also with courts of appeals, with district courts, with the Michigan Supreme Court, with the Michigan Court of Claims. And so a lot of the work that we do in conjunction with our support staff is really, it's crucial without a doubt. And it really comes back to some of those components related to how are we prepping for hearing and what are the best ways that we can leverage our support staff to make sure that we're preparing for an administrative hearing or an appellate matter as thoroughly as possible. Now, I do want to emphasize that at least in my capacity within the labor division, I don't work with paralegals, but that isn't to say that paralegals don't function in some way, shape, or form within the state government. And a lot of times what we will see is that paralegals might be housed within individual state agencies. So it might not always be the case that the Department of Attorney General doesn't employ a great number of paralegals, but it could be the case that the individual state agencies who might have their own in-house counsel are working with paralegals themselves. So in some kind of tangential way, there are still opportunities for paralegals to at least function within certain subjects or fields of law. It just might not always be the case that they are the issues that the Department of Attorney General is working with. And certainly I'm a little bit naive in this regard because, again, I only function within a subset of the AG's office. So paralegals may be leveraged to a greater extent in some of our different divisions. I could certainly speculate that that might be the case in the criminal division. But again, we do have paralegals that work for the state of Michigan. It just might not always be in the capacity as the Department of Attorney General provides that representation. And so with that, I'll take another quick break here and see if there are any questions about the material that I've kind of highlighted here so far.
Don't see anything quite yet, but it's just to kind of expand upon your comments about paralegals maybe not being directly hired, retained by the Attorney General. I'm just tangentially starting to see some growth in other public sectors as well, especially with Oakland County Prosecutor and the newly formed Oakland County Public Defender's Office as well, where in some of the larger cases, I know that they've recently brought in in the defense office, excuse me, in the prosecutor's office. It went so well that they've now sought a budget to add more. And I'm hearing the same with, again, this is very small Oakland County as opposed to the full state, but I'm definitely starting to see a slow but steady growth in public sector positions for paralegals. So that's great to hear that there are opportunities, within those bureaus or divisions or organizations. So thank you for sharing that.
Yeah, no, my pleasure. And I agree with you. Just from a philosophical level, I agree. I think there is a really crucial role that paralegals play, especially within the context of, truthfully, a lot of the work that we engage in. Those are the administrative hearing matters. They are the appellate matters that we encounter. And a lot of that comes by virtue of the fact that these can be incredibly complex matters. And especially when you operate as a counsel for a client, a state agency, a state officer, you are generally not just handling one case at a time. You generally will have a fairly large caseload, and paralegals really do play a very crucial role in allowing some facilitation of I don't want to say easing the burden because they're responsible for their own significant scope of work, but it really does, I think, play a very direct role in assisting attorneys who are really dealing with heavy caseloads. And those paralegals can provide not only kind of the additional second set of eyes just from a practical perspective, but they have their own knowledge and education in certain specialized areas. And I think, for myself, just coming from a prior position with OU and obviously just with my own ethical requirements, my own passion for that particular subject matter, I think there's also a very important dynamic that plays out between paralegals and attorneys, and obviously compliance with, model rules of professional conduct, and making sure that in our capacity as attorneys, we're making sure that those individuals who are working for us. I always say with us because they play an equally important role, but in the context of the model rules of professional conduct, anyone who that attorney has supervisory responsibility for is required to ensure their compliance. And so it's kind of an indirect regulation of support staff of paralegals within the legal profession, but I think it makes it all the more salient that we recognize, how can we work together and how do we ensure that our work comports with ethical obligations as well. And one thing that I did want to highlight here is that, the more I thought about it, I do believe that our corrections division, which again is kind of that separate criminal component, we do employ a certain number of paralegals. And I don't know a great extent about the work that they perform, but just generally, my understanding is that with those paralegals, we obviously within the state of Michigan, the way that some of our employment works, a substantial part, is that individuals are broken down by classification. And so what we oftentimes see is that we will have paralegals of varying experience. And so we might have an entry-level paralegal, we might have a paralegal who is at a more intermediate level, and then a more experienced. And oftentimes those are delineated by a certain number code. So a paralegal 8 might be you're just coming into this field, you're in a more learning capacity, you're performing work under very close supervision of an attorney, and in some cases perhaps an administrative law examiner. And then obviously as you progress in that experience, we have different codes. A paralegal 9, a paralegal 10. You might be more experienced now. You might perform the full range, and your training might, obviously we're always continuing to train, but your training, as some of those core functions are concerned, might be completed at that point. And then certainly we have even more advanced levels, paralegal 11s. But typically, a lot of times, what I understand that work to be comprised of is we might see paralegals engaging in certain legal research, depending on the situation at hand. It could be that they have some involvement in legal memorandum that might be examining how laws are going to apply to different problems that are going to be presented to an attorney on a case. We could see situations where paralegals might be conducting more factual investigations. It could be reviewing a legal opinion. It could be looking at a given pleading, a brief, a contract, other legal documents. It could be some work in with respect to interrogatories, which are going to be part of the discovery process in a given suit. Review of different witness and exhibit lists. Filing of different legal documents and papers. And it could also be, in a very important way, monitoring what's going on with proposed legislation, what's going on with the status of a case, preparing summaries of some of those incidents that are taking place. And I really want to emphasize the importance that those roles play. Obviously, attorneys have their obligations to perform their obligations with zealousness, with competency, to be thorough, knowledgeable, experienced in those areas that they're undertaking. And so they certainly can't shove those off on a paralegal. But a lot of times, I believe attorneys do look very heavily at their support staff to work really in conjunction with one another to know, okay, what's the status of this? What is our filing dates looking like? Are we coming up on those dates? And really, I think paralegals really serve a very vital role in securing a lot of the monitoring aspects. And that's not to downplay the role that paralegals play at all, because that is a crucial step within any case presentation, within any case handling. But again, that's just a subset of the really vital role that paralegals play. I mean, there is a requirement for, and I'm saying requirement in the sense of, I think we all have a professional obligation, whether you're an attorney, a paralegal, we have to have competency as far as legal research is concerned. We have to know distinctions between the branches of government, state and federal laws, different legal concepts. We have to know the distinction between legal documents that are being prepared, the difference between a motion for summary judgment versus a motion to dismiss. We have to know legal terminology. We have to be able to disseminate the information that's being relayed to us from an attorney. And also balancing that with especially as we're starting out in our careers. And even to this day, I myself engage in this all the time, is asking questions when we don't know the answer, or clarifying the information that we think we're reading, but we need to confirm that this is accurately what's being relayed to us. And certainly I think that's true in the context of relationships, professional relationships between attorneys and paralegals, is making sure that when there's discussion about what tasks need to be accomplished, that both individuals are on the same page, that we're both working towards a common goal, and that something wasn't relayed from the attorney to the paralegal and the paralegal heard it as a completely different request. And so I think that effective communication is really a very vital component of that. And not just the component of communication between attorneys and paralegals, but also between paralegals and those individuals that they might be interacting with, who the attorney is being involved in working with. It could be opposing counsel who picks up the phone to place a call and the paralegal answers. There's a question that needs to be relayed to the attorney. And a lot of times, I can certainly speak to this, it is almost always the case, if not always the case, that effective communication with whoever is on the other side of the table from you is always going to yield you greater results than if you take an adversarial, combative stance. So that is something I emphasize, certainly for myself, but for anyone who's in this field, is to really value or prioritize the commitment to understanding how we're communicating with one another, not just internally within our own departments, within our own divisions, our own workplace, but also how we're interacting with opposing counsel in a lot of cases. And I think I touched on this, but then finally, I think a truly crucial component to any paralegal's work and advancement in this career is really the ability to write concisely, to write effectively, and to write with intention and purpose. And I say that with the caveat that I am guilty of not always writing concisely, and that is a continuing item that I am constantly working on. And I do say that sincerely. I would like to think that anyone who is within this field, regardless of how long we have been practicing, you can always find ways to improve your own writing style, your research techniques. And really, the one thing that I can't emphasize enough is to never be afraid to ask a question, whether you think it's dumb, whether you think it's already been answered. I will even preface my questions to others by saying, I'm going to ask you a dumb question, and then here it is. Don't be afraid to do that, because I would rather be the person who asked the dumb question, and there really are no dumb questions, but if there was one, I would probably be the person to ask, so leave it to me. I would rather ask that question than dedicate substantial amounts of time working on something that wasn't requested, that wasn't called for. That's going to lead to breakdowns in communication between you and the attorney you're working with. It's going to waste your time. And I think a lot of times it leads to frustration, because I've been in that position where I've been asked by more senior attorneys to work on items. I didn't understand the question at all, apparently, because when it came back to me, we had a lot of red lines. We had a lot of, this wasn't the question we were asking. And it is demoralizing at times to know, oh, I thought I got it right and I didn't. That is part of the process. But at least for my own experience, if I had been willing to kind of confront some of the uncomfortableness of those interactions, I could have saved myself a lot of time, a lot of heartache in some sense, and a lot of frustration. So I guess I just emphasize with some of my parting words here is, I hope that each of you know nobody ever knows all the answers. So don't ever be afraid to pose those questions, even if you think they've already been answered. Pose them, make sure that you know what you're responsible for, what you're answering. And if you ever find yourself struggling with a certain issue, go and speak with those attorneys who you work with and explain to them where the breakdown is and how you can work together to really clarify those issues moving forward, because that is 99% of the time going to yield you much greater results than if you leave it quiet, than if you never get the question answered, and sometimes if you never even come to understand what the issue was in the first place. So with that, that is really all of the prepared remarks that I had for today. I hope I didn't leave you with too little speaking time, but I also wanted to balance it against the fact that I know you all are incredibly busy, and I wanted to accommodate any questions that I could attempt to answer here today. So with that, I'll conclude my comments, but again, happy to stay and answer any questions that I can.
Fantastic. And before I do open up globally, and please again put comments in the chat or raise your hand, I just wanted to go back on two of the items that you covered, and I'm going to go backwards. The first was the communication, and I just cannot emphasize enough how important it is, like you said, to don't leave the room with your
Yeah.
instructions until you're clear on your instructions, right? And that's your place to ask those questions and to seek the clarity. And and I'm also a big fan of, I get back to my desk, I write it out and say, just want to confirm this is what I heard, this is how I understood it. But that moment that in the room or the Zoom or the call, that's really that first line. So thank you, really for emphasizing that relevance.
No, and I agree wholeheartedly. And the only thing that I would add in addition to that, and I should have spoken to this as well, is always, I think you spoke to a crucial point there. Document what you are doing. Always safeguard yourself. I do it every day of my life.
Mhm.
I might know what the request was that we spoke about verbally, but I'm going to make sure that I document it in an email to say, this is what I understand the request to be, and these are my proposed steps moving forward.
Mhm.
Let's make sure that we're on the same page before either of us find ourselves in the dynamic of we both thought we understood something, but we went in completely different directions to get there. So, yes, I wholeheartedly agree with that. And again, it really is, it doesn't just help with effective communication and confirming that you know the scope of work that you might have been assigned, but it is a very important safeguard for yourself to avoid, not that I'm sure any of you would encounter this, but to avoid that potential where somebody looks back and says, well, that's not what I told you. You can look back and say, look at the email that I sent. This was to clarify exactly what the scope was. So I can't emphasize that enough. And that's been, for me, one of the greatest tools that I leverage or utilize, I should say, not leverage, but utilize, is making sure to protect myself and make sure that I'm protecting what is the actual methods in which and what is the scope of representation that we're providing to the client. And certainly, if I'm a paralegal, how am I fitting into that component?
Absolutely. And Tim, I'll be right with you, but I just wanted to go back to the first thing that I wanted to ask about. We spend the vast majority of our time training our paralegals, typically for private sector positions, right? That's the overwhelming hiring.
Yeah.
We are definitely, as I said, seeing an increase in public sector court positions, judges clerk positions. We talked about the other two offices. If you could, this may be outside your scope, but what would you recommend that paralegals, students, or even folks who are currently working in the private sector focus on if they wanted to transition? What are some of the differences in either course study or extracurricular training? NIFA and NALA have some additional paralegal certifications. Is there anything that you would recommend for folks who really wanted more of an opportunity to get that foothold in the public sector?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. And I really think for me, um, the quite honestly, I think the trajectory of my life, my professional life would have been very different if one of the first law clerk positions that I took was not with the state of Michigan. So for me, kind of just that jumping into it really changed the entire way that I looked at, not that I had a negative view of it, but I didn't know very much about it, and the nuances to it. So really exploring this kind of around 1 year that I spent with the state in a law clerk capacity as I was continuing to go through law school was by far one of the greatest experiences that I had because it showed me this is the field that I really want to get into. And so I worked, in a private capacity after that, representing a lot of public sector unions, but it very much shaped the trajectory in the sense that I knew I wanted to continue working in public sector labor law because I began my career in large part. I had some different positions with law firms while I was still going through law school, but that was really to me one of my first substantial law clerk positions was with the Michigan Employment Relations Commission or the Bureau of Employment Relations. Um, so I think one thing that I would emphasize, though, outside of just jumping into a position with a state agency, though I think that's valuable, and I think just communication, just looking for contacts within those agencies is a vital step because I can tell you a lot of great individuals working for the state of Michigan are more than happy to speak with someone who is interested in public employment to tell them a little bit about the work that they do. So I would never hesitate to tell someone, reach out to the agencies that you think might be handling something or might be working on something that you're interested in. But outside of that, it's interesting because, at least in my opinion, you don't find a substantial amount of curriculum or education that is really dedicated to public sector employment. And I think that makes, at least for me, sometimes a little bit of a frustration because those are the courses that I would have been especially interested to take when I was in law school. Even if, for nothing else, they can provide a really foundational component to understand how is the state government operating when it comes to certain administrative issues. What does representation of a state agency look like? What does it mean for the executive branch to take a certain action as opposed to the legislative? Understanding distinctions between the branches, not just from that constitutional perspective, but from the perspective of what does it mean for state employees to have their terms and conditions controlled by a civil service commission? What does it mean for state employees to unionize as opposed to employees of a municipality? So I think, not to be a downer, I think some of that curriculum is not necessarily always out there. But I can say that in your capacity, if you're working within the private sector, I think it is all the more important to stay cognizant of how the state functions, because what we see so many times is those private sector firms or those private firms that are representing private citizens, private agencies or entities, I should say, they might be going into court on a frequent basis or into an administrative hearing against the state itself. So understanding that process can yield incredible returns. So if you currently find yourself in a private sector position and you're interested in making that transition, I think there's a lot of value in just understanding your dynamic as it relates to the state and their representation of an agency. And I think a lot of times that can transition very well over into the public sector side. And I think you bring potentially a lot of value in the fact that you know what the workings of the opposing party are with ethical considerations in mind, but that you understand how those functions work, how those processes work. And so, even if it's not from a, teaching or instructional capacity, just understanding the dynamic that plays out in the administrative format, in the appellate format, if you're in the courts, that can prove incredibly vital to understanding the dynamics that play out between assistant attorney generals, the Department of Attorney General, and the state agencies themselves. That's my long-winded answer for you.
Thank you. Tim, go ahead.
Uh, Bryan, you talked about uh, written communication and writing, and what have you found helps you as your career progressed? What helps you? mm, how would I help improve my writing outside of, say, of course, my classes and so forth? But what could I do outside of school to help prepare myself for to be a better writer and communicator in the law?
I think that's a great question. I think for myself, trial and error has been essential. I mean, I could read something 100 times, write up a synopsis, but sometimes I think the reality is until you get a second set of eyes on it, you're always going to miss potentially some component that could be improved on. And sometimes that's not through any fault of our own. That's just through understanding how different lenses, how someone else's lens might look at an issue. And you might, just by virtue of that process, that collaboration, understand or come to see, maybe I like that method of writing better than my own. Maybe that was a better way to synthesize the point that I was trying to make. And so I think trial and error is crucial, which is why I would emphasize don't ever be afraid to get feedback that sometimes seems harsh, because you can use it to improve moving forward. But I think outside of that trial and error component, one thing that is really crucial for me is looking at what others have written about similar issues. Sometimes it's even looking at the ultimate decision that a court has issued in a given case. Sometimes those decisions will give out a very clear roadmap about what the issues are before the court, how the court is looking at them. And a lot of times we'll see those decisions are very concise. If we're looking at a preliminary injunction, for example, the court might say, here are the 4 factors I'm looking at. They were satisfied or they weren't, and here's why. A lot of times those can be helpful as just giving you an overarching umbrella idea of what is a court looking at when they're reading something. And that can put you in the mindset of, then that's what I need to write towards. That's my audience. So one, understanding who's the audience that you're writing for. I think also, though, is if you know, for example, that you're working on a certain motion, right? I look frequently, as many motions as I might have written, I am never reluctant to open up, a different motion that we might have worked on in the past or that I might have drafted in the past and look to see how did I frame this issue last time? And if I read it and I think, oh, that was really wordy now that I'm looking at it, weeks later or after it's been filed, and I think maybe I could have improved it. Don't be afraid to look at those prior examples that you've utilized to see, okay, I like what this individual wrote. I think it was a good way to make the issue clearer. I think it was a good example, and I think I can leverage it for my own writing. So I think, again, look to the examples that you yourself might have used in the past, see how those can be improved, and don't hesitate away from going to other colleagues to say, what's your take on this issue? What's your take on this, this draft? Understanding, I always premise this with, within ethical confines, we're speaking to colleagues, but getting the perspective of others is sometimes just the best way to understand, okay, here's what I missed, or here's how I could have improved it. For me, a lot of times, it's that I'm just too wordy. My sentences are too long. I include too much in a single sentence, or I go into areas that maybe were too expansive, were too nuanced for the issue at hand. So again, always bring yourself back to what is the most concise and effective way that I can relay this information, and who is the audience that is ultimately going to read this, right? Because you want to work in conjunction with the attorney that you're working with, but you also want to stay mindful of the fact that ultimately this is going before an administrative law judge, or this is going before a circuit court judge, the Court of Appeals, the Michigan Supreme Court. So I think audience is a crucial component of that as well. Great question.
Thank you. Do we have anyone else that would like a wrap-up question? We're getting into our last few minutes of the hour. Fantastic. Well, Bryan, again, thank you for your time. I can't wait until you do have the opportunity to squeeze in OCC, because I'm just so excited to move forward with having you to join our staff as well. Because I just the breadth that you bring, and again, I'm very encouraged by the increase in public sector positions. So that's just it's been really nice, especially also with the state starting to look at some opportunities for limited paralegal licensing. I think there's huge room capacity for that within public sector as well. So it just continues to grow and flourish. So thank you very much for your time today. I do look forward to the next opportunity where our paths can cross. And please enjoy your weekend, all.
Yes, thank you so much, everyone. And Sarah, I'm looking forward to our paths crossing again. And yeah, this whole event really has made me very encouraged for hopefully what we'll see as maybe a future for some more opportunities for students to take part in courses that are more specifically dedicated to some public sector nuances and issues arising in the public sector. So
Yeah, and
honored to be here
internships
today.
and
Yeah,
externships and any chances for shadowing, all of those are just open doors, and exponentially grow the opportunities.
yeah, very exciting. And again, thank you everyone for taking the time to listen. Pleasure to be here today. Wishing you all nothing but the best.
Thank you so much. Bye, all.
Thank you.
Thank you.